The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Shaquille O'Neal's Miami mansion as he sipped his coffee, scrolling through emails on his phone. His peaceful routine came to an abrupt halt when his assistant walked in, holding an official-looking envelope. "This just came for you," she said, her face showing slight concern. "It looks important." Shaq put down his coffee mug and took the envelope. The return address showed it was from the Miami-Dade County Court. His brow furrowed as he tore it open and pulled out the contents. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his deep voice echoing in the spacious kitchen. The paper in his massive hands was a court summons for a minor traffic violation from 3 weeks ago. He remembered that day clearly. He had been rushing to a charity event for kids with cancer when a police officer pulled him over, claiming he had rolled through a stop sign. Shaq's phone buzzed. It was Tom, his attorney, calling as if he somehow knew about the summons already. "Tom, I just got some court papers," Shaq said, still staring at the document. "I heard about it from a buddy at the courthouse," Tom replied. "Listen, big man, you don't need to worry about this. I can send one of our junior associates to handle it. It's just a formality." Shaq walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the peaceful bay waters. Something didn't sit right with him about sending someone else to handle his business. "Nah, I think I'll go myself," he said after a moment of thought. "Come on, Shaq," Tom argued. "You're too busy for this nonsense. We have people who deal with these things for clients like you." Shaq shook his head, even though Tom couldn't see him through the phone. "That's not how my parents raised me. If I supposedly did something wrong, I should face it myself." Tom sighed loudly. "Fine. The hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Wear something respectable, and for heaven's sake, be on time. Judge Winters doesn't mess around." After hanging up, Shaq pulled up a search on his phone for Judge Harold Winters. News articles and court records painted a picture of a stern, by-the-book judge who had a reputation for treating everyone the same, regardless of their status. Some called him fair, others called him a hardliner. That evening, Shaq laid out his best Navy suit, custom-made to fit his enormous frame. Few people knew about his other work, his other identity beyond the basketball legend and TV personality that everyone recognized. He opened his safe and checked that his credentials were there just in case. He rarely needed to use them, but something told him to be prepared tomorrow. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Shaq tossed and turned, his mind replaying moments from his past. From the courts of the NBA to his work helping kids, to his lesser-known roles serving his community and country. He had worked hard to be more than just a famous athlete. He had earned respect in ways most people would never know about. As dawn broke, Shaq stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie. His reflection showed a man who had grown beyond the young basketball star he once was. His close-cropped hair now showed touches of gray. His eyes carried the wisdom of his many life experiences. Just a routine day in court, he told himself, not knowing that in just a few hours, what should have been a simple traffic hearing would turn into one of the most talked-about moments in the Miami-Dade County Courthouse history. The Miami-Dade County Courthouse buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers hurried through security checkpoints, clutching coffee cups and briefcases. Nervous defendants waited on hard wooden benches, checking the time every few minutes. It was just another Tuesday morning until Shaquille O'Neal arrived. Shaq stepped through the main entrance and heads turned immediately. At 7 he stood out everywhere he went. He wore his Navy suit with a crisp white shirt and a blue tie that brought out the warmth in his brown eyes. Despite his celebrity status, he waited in line for the security check like everyone else. "Good morning," he said to the security guard, a middle-aged man whose eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. O'Neal," the guard stammered, clearly starstruck. I need to check your bag, sir." Shaq smiled warmly. "Of course, just doing your job." As he made his way to courtroom 305, people in the hallway did double takes. Some whispered excitedly to each other. A few brave souls approached him for autographs, which he politely declined with a, "Not today, folks. I'm here on serious business." Outside courtroom 305, Shaq checked his watch, 8:45 a.m. He was early, just as his mama had always taught him to be. He took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The effect was immediate. The normal chatter of a courtroom before session died in an instant. All eyes turned to the doorway where Shaq stood, having to duck slightly to enter. The silence lasted only a moment before being replaced by excited whispers. "Is that really him? What's Shaq doing here? Did you bring something for him to sign?" Shaq ignored the whispers as he made his way down the center aisle. The standard-sized chairs in the gallery looked like dollhouse furniture compared to his massive frame. He found a spot in the back row where he could stretch his long legs into the aisle. A young court clerk kept stealing glances at him, clearly trying to work up the courage to say something. Finally, she approached. "Mr. O'Neill," she said quietly, "your case is 15th on the docket. It might be a couple of hours." "Thank you," Shaq replied with a gentle smile. "I've got nowhere else to be." At precisely 9 o'clock a.m., a side door opened and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Harold Winters presiding." Everyone stood as Judge Winters entered. He was a thin man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. His black robe seemed to hang from his narrow shoulders as he took his seat at the bench. "Be seated," he said, not bothering to look up as he sorted through papers. The first 14 cases moved quickly. Minor traffic violations, small claims disputes, a couple of petty theft charges. Judge Winters handled each with brisk efficiency, showing little patience for excuses or long explanations. Finally, the clerk called out, "Case number 27,593, State of Florida versus Shaquille O'Neal, charged with failure to come to a complete stop, had a designated stop sign." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Shaq stood up. His knees popped loudly in protest after sitting for so long. He straightened his tie and made his way to the defendant's table, feeling every eye in the room on him. For the first time that morning, Judge Winters looked up from his papers. His eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the enormous man standing before him. But unlike most people who met Shaq, the judge's expression showed no hint of being impressed. "Mr. O'Neill," Judge Winters said, finally addressing him directly. His voice was dry as sandpaper. "How do you plead to the charge?" Shaq stood tall, hands clasped respectfully in front of him. The same hands that had dunked countless basketballs and won 4 NBA championships now waited for justice from a man who clearly couldn't care less about sports achievements. "Your Honor," Shaq began, his deep voice filling the courtroom, "I'm here to explain the circumstances." Little did he know, those circumstances were about to turn this routine traffic hearing into something nobody in the courtroom would ever forget. Judge Winters leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, looking down at Shaq from the raised bench. The height difference between them might have been comical under different circumstances, Shaq standing tall enough that his eyes were almost level with the judge despite the elevated platform. "Mr. O'Neill," Judge Winters began, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom. He peered over his reading glasses with what could only be described as distaste. "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence today." Shaq kept his expression neutral, though he was surprised by the judge's tone. He'd been in courtrooms before, mostly for positive reasons like being sworn in for various law enforcement positions, but he'd never been addressed quite like this. "Yes, Your Honor," Shaq replied respectfully. "I believe it's important, Toe." "I didn't ask for your opinion on what's important," Judge Winters cut him off sharply. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young assistant district attorney looked down at her papers, clearly embarrassed by the judge's behavior. Judge Winters picked up the citation and made a show of reading it, though it was clear he already knew the details. "So you think stop signs are optional in Miami? Or perhaps the rules of the road don't apply to celebrities?" He practically spat out the last word. "No, Your Honor," Shaq replied evenly. "I respect the law. There were special circumstances that day that I'd like to explain." The judge waved his hand dismissively. "There are always special circumstances with people like you, aren't there? Let me guess, you were late for a shoe commercial. Or maybe a pizza endorsement." A few people in the courtroom gasped quietly at the judge's open disrespect. Even the court reporter paused for a second, fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. "Actually, Your Honor," Shaq started again, his voice still calm, "I was on my way to." "I'm not impressed by celebrity status in my courtroom, Mr. O'Neill," Judge Winters interrupted again, his voice growing colder. "This is a place of law. not a basketball court where you can throw your weight around. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, glanced sympathetically at Shaq. He'd clearly seen this behavior from the judge before. You think the rules don't apply to someone of your stature? Judge Winters continued, emphasizing the word with a smirk, clearly making a jab at Shaq's height. A few people in the back row whispered to each other, shocked by the judge's unprofessional behavior. Shaq took a deep breath. In his younger days, he might have responded differently to someone talking to him this way. But years of growth, education, and his work outside of basketball had taught him patience. Still, he could feel a slight heat rising in his neck, not from anger, but from disappointment. He'd expected better from an official of the court. Your Honor, Shaq tried again, I understand the seriousness of traffic laws. I've actually worked extensively with. Save it, Judge Winters cut him off yet again. I've heard enough excuses today already. The fine is $250. Pay it on your way out, unless that's too much for your NBA pension. The judge's lips curled into another mocking smile as scattered, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the courtroom. Shaq stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The judge clearly expected him to either lose his temper or slink away defeated. He would do neither. Instead, Shaq reached slowly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The motion caught Judge Winters' attention, his eyebrows raising slightly in curiosity. Your Honor, Shaq said, his voice now carrying a weight and authority that seemed to fill the room, before I pay any fine, there's something I think you should see. The entire courtroom fell completely silent, every eye fixed on Shaq's large hand as he began to pull something from his pocket. Whatever it was caught the light, something metallic gleaming between his fingers. Judge Winters leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, looking down at Shaq from the raised bench. The height difference between them might have been comical under different circumstances, Shaq standing tall enough that his eyes were almost level with the judge despite the elevated platform. Mr. O'Neill, Judge Winters began, his voice echoing through the now silent courtroom. He peered over his reading glasses with what could only be described as distaste. I see you've decided to grace us with your presence today. Shaq kept his expression neutral, though he was surprised by the judge's tone. He'd been in courtrooms before, mostly for positive reasons like being sworn in for various law enforcement positions, but he'd never been addressed quite like this. Yes, Your Honor, Shaq replied respectfully. I believe it's important, Toe. I didn't ask for your opinion on what's important. Judge Winters cut him off sharply. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The young assistant district attorney looked down at her papers, clearly embarrassed by the judge's behavior. Judge Winters picked up the citation and made a show of reading it, though it was clear he already knew the details. So you think stop signs are optional in Miami? Or perhaps the rules of the road don't apply to celebrities? He practically spat out the last word. No, Your Honor, Shaq replied evenly. I respect the law. There were special circumstances that day that I'd like to explain. The judge waved his hand dismissively. There are always special circumstances with people like you, aren't there? Let me guess, you were late for a shoe commercial. Or maybe a pizza endorsement. A few people in the courtroom gasped quietly at the judge's open disrespect. Even the court reporter paused for a second, fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. Actually, Your Honor, Shaq started again, his voice still calm. I'm on my way, Toe. I'm not impressed by celebrity status in my courtroom, Mr. O'Neill. Judge Winters interrupted again, his voice growing colder. This is a place of law, not a basketball court where you can throw your weight around. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, glanced sympathetically at Shaq. He'd clearly seen this behavior from the judge before. You think the rules don't apply to someone of your stature? Judge Winters continued, emphasizing the word with a smirk, clearly making a jab at Shaq's height. A few people in the back row whispered to each other, shocked by the judge's unprofessional behavior. Shaq took a deep breath. In his younger days, he might have responded differently to someone talking to him this way. But years of growth, education, and his work outside of basketball had taught him patience. Still, he could feel a slight heat rising in his neck, not from anger, but from disappointment. He'd expected better from an official of the court. Your Honor, Shaq tried again, I understand the seriousness of traffic laws. I've actually worked extensively with. Save it, Judge Winters cut him off yet again. I've heard enough excuses today already. The fine is $250. Pay it on your way out, unless that's too much for your NBA pension. The judge's lips curled into another mocking smile as scattered, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the courtroom. Shaq stood perfectly still, his expression unchanged. The judge clearly expected him to either lose his temper or slink away defeated. He would do neither. Instead, Shaq reached slowly into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The motion caught Judge Winters' attention, his eyebrows raising slightly in curiosity. "Your Honor," Shaq said, his voice now carrying a weight and authority that seemed to fill the room, "before I pay any fine, there's something I think you should see." The entire courtroom fell completely silent, every eye fixed on Shaq's large hand as he began to pull something from his pocket. Whatever it was caught the light, something metallic gleaming between his fingers. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as Shaq's hand emerged from his jacket pocket. Between his massive fingers was something small and metallic that caught the fluorescent lights. Judge Winters leaned forward slightly, his mocking smile fading as curiosity took over. "Your Honor," Shaq said in his deep, measured voice that carried to every corner of the now silent room, "with all due respect, I believe there's been a misunderstanding about who I am and why I was on the road that day." He opened his hand fully, revealing an official badge in a leather wallet. The shield-shaped metal gleamed as he held it up for the judge to see. "What is this supposed to be?" Judge Winters asked, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "Some honorary badge they give to celebrities for photo ops." Shaq stepped closer to the bench and respectfully placed the credentials on the judge's desk. "No, Your Honor. These are my official United States Secret Service credentials." The words hung in the air for a moment before a wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. People leaned forward in their seats, straining to get a better look. Judge Winters picked up the badge with trembling fingers. His face, previously flushed with the pleasure of putting a celebrity in his place, now drained of color. He studied the official identification card next to the badge, looking from the photo to Shaq's face and back again. This is genuine," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Yes, sir," Shaq confirmed. "I've been working with the U.S. Secret Service for several years now. The day I received that traffic citation, I was responding to an urgent situation regarding a cybercrime case involving children's safety." The court clerk's mouth hung open in shock. The young assistant district attorney was frantically flipping through her notes, clearly wondering why this information hadn't been in her file. "Why wasn't I informed of this?" Judge Winters demanded, looking around the courtroom as if someone might have an answer. "The nature of my work requires discretion, Your Honor," Shaq explained calmly. "I don't publicize my role with the service. Only a handful of people know about it." A middle-aged woman in the front row of the gallery whispered loudly to her friend, "I'd always knew he was more than just a basketball player." Judge Winters cleared his throat, clearly struggling to process this new information. He adjusted his glasses and examined the credentials one more time, as if hoping they might somehow be fake. They weren't. "These are indeed official federal credentials," he finally admitted, his voice much softer than before. "Special Deputy U.S. Secret Service." He handed the badge and ID back to Shaq, who tucked them carefully back into his inner jacket pocket. "The day in question," Shaq continued, "I received an urgent call about a case I've been working on. It involves protecting children from online predators. When the officer pulled me over, I was actually heading to a location where we believed a suspect was operating. I didn't identify myself as Secret Service to the officer because we were trying to keep the operation quiet." Judge Winters' face had now shifted from pale shock to deep embarrassment. The same man who moments ago had been mocking Shaq's celebrity status was now faced with the reality that he had been belittling a federal agent who was protecting children. I see," the judge stammered, shuffling papers on his desk to avoid making eye contact with anyone in the room. "This certainly puts things in a different light." The courtroom remained silent as everyone tried to process what they had just learned. Shaquille O'Neal, basketball legend, sports commentator, and commercial star, was also a U.S. Secret Service agent. It seemed impossible, yet the proof had been right there in the judge's hands. "Perhaps," Judge Winters said, Trying to regain his composure, "You could explain a bit more about your position with the Secret Service, Dr. O'Neill." The judge now used Shaq's academic title, a complete reversal from his earlier mocking tone. Shaq nodded, his expression serious. "I'd be happy to share what I can, Your Honor, though some details must remain confidential." He turned slightly to address both the judge and the captivated courtroom. "After I retired from basketball, I wanted to give back in ways that went beyond charity work and endorsements. I've always had a deep respect for law enforcement." A few people in the gallery nodded. Those who followed Shaq's career knew about his interest in police work, but few knew how far it went. "I started by getting my doctorate in education," Shaq continued. "Many people don't know that about me. Then I went through several specialized training programs with different law enforcement agencies." He shifted his weight, his large frame casting a shadow across the courtroom floor. "About 5 years ago, the Secret Service approached me for a special program. They were expanding their cybercrime division, particularly focusing on crimes against children online. They thought my visibility with young people might be useful." An older man in the third row wiped away a tear. His grandson had recently been saved from an online predator, though he had no idea Shaq might have been involved. "I completed their training program and was sworn in as a reserve officer and special deputy," Shaq explained. "Most of my work involves education and prevention programs, but I also assist with certain operations. I help track people who target kids online." Judge Winter's demeanor had completely changed. His earlier arrogance was replaced with something close to awe. "And the day of this traffic incident?" he asked softly. "We had tracked a suspect who was part of a network distributing harmful content involving minors," Shaq said, carefully choosing his words to keep them appropriate for the open courtroom. "I received an urgent call that they had located the suspect's possible hideout. I was headed to join the team when I was pulled over." The officer who had issued the citation was actually in the courtroom, waiting for another case. He stood up from his seat in the back. "Officer Rodriguez," the judge acknowledged with surprise. "Your Honor," the officer said, "if I had known who Mr. O'Neill was working with that day, I would have escorted him to his destination." Shaq smiled at the officer. "You were doing your job, sir. I respect that. And we did apprehend the suspect later that day." A quiet murmur of appreciation rippled through the courtroom. People looked at Shaq with new eyes, not as a celebrity, but as someone who used his fame and resources to protect the most vulnerable. "Few people know about my role," Shaq continued. "I don't do it for recognition. I use my public persona as a cover. It helps me reach people who might not trust a typical agent. Kids know me as the fun guy from commercials and basketball. That trust can be valuable in certain situations." The court reporter had stopped typing, too engrossed in Shaq's story to remember her job. The bailiff had to gently nudge her back to attention. Judge Winters removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The man standing before him was not who he had thought. Not at all. He had misjudged Shaquille O'Neal in every possible way, and now he had to figure out how to make it right. Judge Winters cleared his throat several times, adjusting his robe and straightening papers that didn't need straightening. The courtroom remained hushed, waiting for his response. Never before had the regular visitors of courtroom 305 seen the stern judge so clearly uncomfortable. "Dr. O'Neill," he finally said, his voice notably softer than before. I was not aware of your position with the Secret Service." He removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench before continuing. "Nor was I aware of the circumstances surrounding the traffic citation." Shaq stood tall but humble, his hands clasped in front of him. He didn't appear to be enjoying the judge's discomfort, despite how poorly he had been treated earlier. "The court owes you an apology for the mischaracterization," Judge Winters continued. "My comments were inappropriate and uninformed." A young law student in the third row scribbled frantically in her notebook. In 3 years of observing Judge Winters for her studies, she had never heard him apologize to anyone. "Thank you, Your Honor," Shaq replied simply. He wasn't interested in rubbing it in or making the situation worse. The judge looked around the packed courtroom, aware that every eye was on him. His reputation for being tough but fair was now in question. He knew he needed to make this right, not just for Shaq, but for the dignity of his courtroom. In light of the information provided, Judge Winters announced formally, "This case is dismissed with the court's sincere apologies." He banged his gavel once, making it official. But then, surprisingly, he stood up from behind the bench, something he rarely did during proceedings. "Dr. O'Neill, if I might have a word with you privately," he said, gesturing toward his chambers. The bailiff called for a 15-minute recess, and the judge led Shaq through a side door while the courtroom buzzed with excited chatter. Inside the judge's chambers, the mood shifted. The small office with its dark wood paneling and law books seemed even smaller with Shaq's presence. Judge Winters removed his black robe, hanging it carefully on a coat rack, revealing a simple shirt and tie underneath. Without the robe, he looked older, more human. "Please, sit down," he offered, pointing to a leather chair that seemed much too small for Shaq's frame. "I'll stand if you don't mind," Shaq replied with a slight smile. The judge nodded and leaned against his desk. "What I set out there wasn't enough," he admitted. "I judged you based on what I thought I knew about you. A wealthy sports star who expected special treatment. I was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Shaq nodded, accepting the apology. "We all make judgments based on what we see on the surface, Your Honor. I've dealt with it my whole life." The judge looked up at him, curious. "How do you handle it? People thinking they know you when they don't?" Shaq thought for a moment before answering. "I just try to be the best version of myself every day. What others think, that's on them, not me." Judge Winters nodded slowly, taking in the wisdom of the words. "My late wife was a big fan of yours," he said unexpectedly. "She always said you were more than just a basketball player." Seems she was right. "She sounds like a smart lady," Shaq replied with a gentle smile. "The smartest," the judge agreed, a flash of grief crossing his face. "She would have loved to know about your work protecting children. We never had kids of our own." Something passed between the two men then, an understanding, a connection that transcended their different lives and the unpleasant encounter in the courtroom. "Your work," Judge Winters said, "it matters. More than you know." Shaq nodded in appreciation. "So does yours, Your Honor. We're both just trying to make things right in our own ways." The judge extended his hand, which disappeared completely in Shaq's massive grip. "Thank you for your service, Dr. O'Neill. Not just to the country, but to its children." As Shaq pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped outside, he was greeted by a wall of noise. Word had spread quickly. At least 24 reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing and microphones extended toward him like hungry birds. "Dr. O'Neill, is it true you work for the Secret Service?" "Shaq, how long have you been an agent? Can you tell us about your role with the government?" Shaq raised his hands, silencing the crowd with the same commanding presence that had once controlled basketball courts across the country. The afternoon sun highlighted the lines around his eyes, evidence of both laughter and concern throughout his years of service, both public and secret. "Folks," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the courthouse steps, "I appreciate your interest, but there's not much I can share about my work." A reporter from a local news station pushed forward. "But it's true. You're actually a Secret Service agent." Shaq smiled patiently. "I can confirm that I serve my country in ways beyond what most people know. Protecting children has always been important to me, but the details of that work need to stay private for the safety of everyone involved." "What about Judge Winters?" called out another reporter. "We heard he was pretty tough on you before he knew who you were." "The judge was doing his job," Shaq replied diplomatically. "He treats everyone the same in his courtroom, regardless of who they are. I respect that." As the questions continued, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. The driver, wearing sunglasses and a suit, nodded discreetly to Shaq. "That's all for today," Shaq told the crowd, starting to make his way down the steps. "I've got somewhere to be." An older reporter who had covered Shaq since his rookie years called out one last question. "Shaq, has serving your country been as rewarding as winning those championship rings?" Shaq paused and turned back. His face grew serious as he considered the question. "Those championships meant everything to me as an athlete," he said thoughtfully. "But helping keep kids safe? That means everything to me as a human being." With that, he climbed into the waiting SUV and disappeared, leaving the reporters with a story few would have believed possible that morning. By evening, the courthouse incident was all over the news. Video clips from people's phones showed the moment Shaq revealed his badge. Social media exploded with comments and shares. Some people claimed they'd always suspected Shaq was more than just an athlete and entertainer. Others expressed surprise but admiration for his secret service. In his office across town, Judge Winters watched the coverage on a small TV. His phone had been ringing all afternoon. Colleagues, friends, even a few reporters brave enough to call a sitting judge directly. He'd answered none of them. Instead, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out an old photograph of himself and his late wife at a basketball game years ago. They were both smiling, his wife wearing Shaq's jersey number. "You were right about him, honey," he whispered to the photo. Meanwhile, in a secure building downtown, Shaq sat in a briefing room with 4 other agents. They were discussing their next operation. Another group of online predators targeting kids through a popular gaming platform. "You've become quite famous, again," said the team leader with a smirk, pointing to a muted TV in the corner showing Shaq outside the courthouse. Shaq shrugged. "Fame comes and goes. The work is what matters." As the meeting continued, Shaq checked his phone. There was a message from his mother. "Saw you on the news. Your father would be so proud." "I know I am." He smiled and tucked the phone away. Championship rings sat in display cases. Trophies gathered dust on shelves. But knowing he'd earned the respect of people who mattered, his parents, his colleagues, and even a tough old judge who'd seen it all, that was worth more than all the fame in the world.